They say the universe has a cruel sense of humor. I believed that until I met humans. Now I know the universe doesn't just have a sense of humor. It has a death wish. My name is Zeth, and I am what your species would call a war correspondent. For 3 centuries, I have documented conflicts across 17 galaxies, witnessed the rise and fall of empires, and seen species that could crack planets like eggs kneel before superior firepower. I thought I had seen everything the cosmos had to offer in terms of warfare, strategy, and the lengths beings would go to for survival. I was wrong. The humans changed everything. They didn't just fight, they rewrote the very definition of what it meant to refuse surrender. When I first received the assignment to document their war against the Kethmoran hegemony, I expected another routine extermination campaign. The hegemony had crushed 47 species in the past millennium. Humans had barely achieved faster-than-light travel. It should have been a slaughter. Instead, I witnessed something that still keeps me awake during my rest cycles. Something that made me understand why the oldest species in the galaxy speak of Earth in hushed whispers, why trade routes bend around human space, and why even the Eternal Council, beings who have existed since the first stars ignited, watch humanity's expansion with a mixture of fascination and terror. You see, every species fights to live. Humans fight as if death itself owes them money. This is the story of how I learned that lesson. How I discovered that when humans say never again, they don't just mean it as a promise to their own kind. They mean it as a warning to the universe itself. And how I came to understand that sometimes the most terrifying thing you can hear in the darkness of space isn't the roar of weapons or the screams of the dying. It's the sound of a human saying, "Hold my beer," in that particular tone they use right before they do something that makes gods reconsider their career choices. This is my account of the siege of Corvash Prime, where 30,000 humans held off 3 million Kethmoran warriors for 47 days. Where I learned that human military doctrine has only one rule. If you're not cheating, you're not trying hard enough. And where I discovered that the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy isn't a planet killer or a reality warping device. It's a human who's run out of coffee and has access to an engineering manual. The universe will never be the same. Neither will the transport vessel documented dropped out of hyperspace 3 astronomical units from Corvash Prime, and immediately, every sensor on the ship started screaming warnings that couldn't possibly be accurate. Zeth's 4 eyes focused independently on different readouts, a natural adaptation that had served his species well in their role as the galaxy's premier war correspondents. What he saw defied 3 centuries of combat experience. "Sensor malfunction," he muttered in galactic standard, his translator struggling with the concept since his native language had 17 different words for impossible thing happening in defiance of logic. He ran a full diagnostic on the equipment. Everything checked out perfectly. According to his instruments, 30,000 human soldiers were somehow holding defensive positions against 3 million Kethmoran warriors. The math simply didn't work. The Kethmoran were professional killers, each standing 3 meters tall with natural armor plating and reflexes that made them nearly unstoppable in ground combat. They had conquered 47 worlds using the same basic strategy: land overwhelming numbers and crush all resistance through sheer biological superiority. Humans, by comparison, were tiny, soft, and had only discovered faster-than-light travel 47 years ago. Their military technology was primitive by galactic standards, and their biology marked them as prey animals on any civilized threat assessment scale. They should have been extinct within hours of first contact. Instead, his sensors were detecting active defensive positions, coordinated artillery strikes, and what appear to be massive engineering projects being completed in real time under heavy fire. The Kethmoran fleet in orbit wasn't even attempting orbital bombardment, which struck Zeth as odd until he noticed the debris field surrounding the planet. Twisted metal and exotic energy signatures suggested that several Kethmoran dreadnoughts had recently experienced what military analysts term catastrophic existence failure. Captain Vorthik, a seasoned Galaxian who commanded the Documenta, emerged from the bridge looking like someone had just explained quantum physics using interpretive dance. War correspondent, he said in the formal tone military personnel used when reality had broken and they needed a witness. We're receiving a transmission from the surface. It's unusual. Zeth Carey followed the captain to the communications array, where a young human face appeared on the holographic display. The human looked impossibly calm for someone in the middle of what should have been a hopeless last stand. Dark circles under his eyes suggested extended sleep deprivation, and there was dried blood on his uniform, but he was actually smiling. This is Lieutenant Sarah Chun, Acting Communications Officer for Human Defense Force Firebase Alpha. The transmission began. We're aware you're press, and we've got a great story for you. Fair warning, though, things are about to get weird, and your insurance probably doesn't cover acts of human ingenuity as a category of damage. Zeth Carey activated his recording equipment. In 3 centuries of war correspondence, he had never heard a military officer use the phrase, "things are about to get weird," with quite that level of cheerful anticipation. Please define weird in this context. He transmitted back, using his most professional tone. The human smile widened. Well, sir, about 6 hours ago, our engineering corps finished converting the planet's primary mining laser into what our commander is calling a really enthusiastic door knocker. We're about to use it to redecorate the Keth-Moran orbital positions. After that, we're implementing what the manual calls aggressive urban restructuring using their own kinetic bombardment systems. Zeth Carey's recording equipment automatically flagged the transmission for review by military analysts, since it appeared to contain impossible tactical claims. Mining lasers were designed to cut through asteroid rock, not engage military targets. And human engineering capabilities were far too primitive to accomplish orbital weapons conversion in a combat environment. Lieutenant Shun, he transmitted, are you indicating that human forces have somehow weaponized civilian mining equipment and captured enemy orbital bombardment systems? Oh no, sir, Chen replied, her expression shifting to one of mild disappointment, as if Zeth Carey had somehow missed the obvious. We didn't capture their bombardment systems. We convinced them to point the other way. Turns out, if you hack their targeting computers and feed them false gravity readings, they start shooting at their own fleet. The Keth-Moran really should have invested in better cybersecurity. The communication ended with what Zeth Carey would later learn was a distinctly human gesture. Lieutenant Shun gave a cheerful wave before the screen went dark, just as massive energy signatures began lighting up the orbital space around Corvash Prime. Captain Vorthicay stared at the tactical display in the way beings stare at things when their understanding of the universe has just been gently, but firmly relocated. War correspondent, he said slowly, in your professional opinion, should we move to a safer distance? Before Zeth Carey could respond, the planet's primary mining laser, a piece of industrial equipment designed to cut through solid rock at close range, somehow fired a coherent energy beam that reached orbit and began systematically disassembling a Keth-Moran heavy cruiser. The beam didn't just damage the ship. It peeled away its armor plating in perfectly geometric strips, like someone opening a particularly large and explosive present. Yes, Zeth Carey said, watching the cruiser's ammunition stores detonate in a chain reaction that lit up the system's outer asteroid belt. Yes, we should definitely move to a safer distance. As the Documenta retreated to what Captain Vorthicay hoped would be a safe observation range, Zeth Carey began composing his initial report. The Galactic Press Corps had strict guidelines about extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence, but his recording equipment was capturing everything. The systematic destruction of a battle fleet by what appeared to be mining equipment. Coordinated ground defenses that somehow held against 100-to-1 odds. And, most disturbing of all, human military personnel who acted as if these impossibilities were merely Tuesday afternoon activities. The surface of Corvash Prime was a maze of defensive positions that seemed to have been constructed in complete violation of established military doctrine. Instead of traditional fortifications, the humans had apparently hollowed out entire city blocks and converted them into three-dimensional battlefields. Kethmoran forces were being funneled into carefully constructed kill zones, where the environment itself had become a weapon. Zethkari sensors detected massive underground complexes that definitely hadn't been there when the siege began. Either humans had somehow completed months of engineering work in a matter of days, or they had access to technology that made his species' most advanced construction equipment look like stone knives and bearskins. Neither option made sense. A new transmission arrived from the surface, this time from a different human. The man looked even more exhausted than Lieutenant Shun, but he was wearing what Zethkari's cultural database identified as a shit-eating grin. Press Vessel Documenta. This is Colonel James Harrison, Human Defense Force. We've got a situation developing that you might want to document. In about 20 minutes, we're going to demonstrate why human military engineers consider the phrase impossible to be a personal challenge rather than a statement of fact. Colonel Harrison, Zethkari transmitted, what exactly are you planning? Harrison's expression shifted to one of pure, undiluted mischief. Well, sir, we've been doing some calculations. Turns out that if you take a planet's rotational energy and redirect it through carefully placed gravity manipulators, which we totally didn't steal from the Kethmoran, we just found them lying around after they accidentally dropped them while shooting at us. You can create what our physics team is calling a really big slingshot. Zethkari felt a chill run through his exoskeleton. Colonel, are you suggesting that you're going to use the planet itself as a weapon? Oh no, sir, Harrison replied, his grin widening to dimensions that suggested either extreme confidence or complete psychological breakdown. We're going to use the planet's moon as a weapon. The planet is just the delivery system. The transmission ended just as gravitational anomalies began registering across the entire system. Zethkari watched his instruments in fascination and growing horror as the humans somehow altered the orbital mechanics of an entire planetary system to turn celestial bodies into artillery shells. This was his first glimpse into the fundamental truth that would reshape his understanding of warfare. Humans didn't just fight with the weapons they had. They fought with the weapons they could imagine, and their imagination was apparently unlimited by conventional concepts like physics or sanity. Captain Vorthake ordered the Documenta to retreat to the system's outer edge as gravitational waves began affecting local space-time. War correspondent, he said in the tone of someone whose worldview had just been systematically demolished by beings who weren't even supposed to be capable of surviving their first contact with galactic civilization. I think we're going to need a bigger Category 4 acts of human ingenuity in our insurance policy. Zethkari could only nod as he watched 30,000 humans prepare to use astronomy as a weapon system. His 3 centuries of war correspondence had not prepared him for this. Nothing could have prepared anyone for this. The siege of Corvash Prime was just beginning, and already every rule of warfare he thought he knew was being rewritten by a species that apparently viewed impossible as a starting point rather than a conclusion. The gravitational manipulation that humans accomplished on Day 7 of the siege would have taken Zethkari's species approximately 40 years to plan and execute. The humans completed it in 18 hours using equipment they had apparently assembled from spare parts, and what their technical manuals euphemistically called aggressive field modifications. Zethkari watched from the bridge of the Documenta as Corvash Prime's smaller moon gradually shifted out of its natural orbit. The calculations required for such an operation should have overwhelmed even the most advanced quantum computers, but the humans had somehow delegated the mathematical heavy lifting to what appear to be gaming systems and coffee makers that they had networked together into a distributed processing array. This is scientifically impossible, Captain Vorthake muttered for the 47th time since the siege began. The Galaxian had begun keeping count after the humans used atmosphere processors to create localized weather systems that somehow generated lightning strikes on command. Sir, Zethkari replied, adjusting his recording equipment to capture the astronomical impossibility unfolding before them. I'm beginning to suspect that humans have a different relationship with scientific impossibility than the rest of us. The surface of Corvash Prime had been transformed into something that violated every principle of military engineering that Zeth Carey had learned in 3 centuries of war correspondence. The humans hadn't just built fortifications, they had turned the entire planet into a weapon system. Mining tunnels had become artillery tubes. Subway systems had been converted into rapid deployment networks that allowed human forces to appear anywhere on the battlefield within minutes. Sewage treatment plants were somehow generating exotic energy signatures that his sensors couldn't classify. A transmission arrived from Colonel Harrison, who looked like he hadn't slept in several days, but was practically vibrating with excitement. Press vessel, we're about to field test our new artillery system. You might want to record this for posterity. What kind of artillery system? Zeth Carey transmitted back, though he was beginning to suspect that asking humans to explain their weapons was like asking a storm to explain why it decided to become a tornado. Well, Harrison replied, gesturing to something off-screen that was generating ominous mechanical sounds. We figured out that if you take a mass driver, which we built using components from 17 different mining operations, and load it with projectiles that we manufactured using compressed garbage and kitchen supplies, you can create what our ballistics team is calling economical enthusiasm delivery systems. Zeth Carey's translator worked overtime trying to process the phrase economical enthusiasm delivery systems before giving up and marking it as uniquely human military terminology. On his tactical display, he watched as the humans fired what appeared to be refuse bins at the Kethmoran positions. Each projectile hit with enough kinetic energy to level city blocks. Colonel Harrison, Zeth Carey transmitted, "Are you telling me that humans have weaponized garbage?" "Oh no, sir," Harrison replied with the sort of smile that suggested either genius or madness, and possibly both. "We've weaponized recycling. The garbage was just the raw material. Each projectile contains approximately 47 different types of improvised explosive devices, 3 varieties of chemical irritants that we synthesized using cleaning supplies, and what our demolitions expert calls happy little surprises. The projectiles began detonating on impact, and each explosion was different from the last. Some created massive kinetic shockwaves. Others generated electromagnetic pulses that disabled Kethmoran equipment. A few apparently released clouds of something that made enemy soldiers break formation and flee while scratching frantically at their armor. "What exactly are happy little surprises?" Zeth Carey asked, though he was beginning to understand that asking humans to explain their weapons was an exercise in discovering new forms of controlled insanity. Harrison's grin widened. "Well, sir, our chemical engineer figured out that if you combine standard military rations with certain atmospheric gases and add what she calls aggressive seasoning, you can create compounds that make enemy soldiers extremely uncomfortable in very specific ways." Zeth Carey watched as Kethmoran warriors, beings who could normally fight through injuries that would be fatal to most species, abandoned their positions and retreated at maximum speed from areas where the happy little surprises had detonated. His sensors detected no lethal agents, but something was definitely affecting enemy morale in ways that traditional chemical weapons could never achieve. The humans had apparently weaponized embarrassment. Captain Vorthake joined Zeth Carey at the observation station, staring at the tactical display with the expression of someone whose understanding of warfare had been systematically demolished and rebuilt using principles that defied logic. "War correspondent," he said slowly, "in your professional opinion, how does one document a species that appears to treat the laws of physics as suggestions and military doctrine as comedy material?" Before Zeth Carey could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. The gravitational manipulation that the humans had been conducting was reaching its conclusion, and the smaller moon of Corvash Prime was now on a trajectory that would bring it within the planet's atmospheric envelope in approximately 6 hours. A new transmission arrived, this time from a human who introduced herself as Dr. Elena Vasquez, Human Defense Force Physics Consultant. She looked like someone who had been living on coffee and pure mathematics for the past week, but her eyes held the sort of focused intensity that Zeth Carey had only seen in beings who were about to achieve something unprecedented. Press vessel, we want to give you advance notice that we're about to demonstrate what human physicists call aggressive gravity modification. In about 5 hours and 43 minutes, we're going to use the moon as what our tactical team refers to as a really big rock with attitude. Zeth Carey's recording equipment automatically flagged the transmission as requiring immediate review by theoretical physics specialists. Dr. Vasquez, he transmitted, are you indicating that humans have developed technology capable of using celestial bodies as projectile weapons? Oh no, sir, Dr. Vasquez replied, her expression shifting to one of mild confusion, as if Zeth Carey had missed something obvious. We didn't develop any new technology. We just convinced existing technology to work harder than it was originally designed to. Turns out that if you ask equipment nicely and provide adequate caffeine to the engineering team, most machinery will perform functions that aren't technically in its specifications. She gestured to something off-screen that was generating energy signatures unlike anything in Zeth Carey's database. We're using gravity manipulators that we found after the Kethmoran accidentally left them behind during their first assault wave. Our engineering team figured out that if you connect them in series and feed them power from approximately 47 different sources simultaneously, you can create localized gravitational fields strong enough to alter planetary orbital mechanics. The transmission paused as explosions echoed in the background. Dr. Vasquez glanced off-screen with mild annoyance. Sorry about that. The enemy is attempting another ground assault, but our defensive systems are handling it. Where was I? Oh yes, aggressive gravity modification. The beauty of our approach is that we're not violating any laws of physics. We're just applying them in ways that the original designers probably never imagined. Zeth Carey could see the moon growing larger in his visual displays as it approached the planet. The gravitational effects were creating atmospheric disturbances that were visible from orbit, and his sensors were detecting massive energy buildups across the human defensive positions. Dr. Vasquez, he transmitted, what exactly do you plan to do with the moon once it reaches the planet? Her smile suggested the sort of controlled madness that Zeth Carey was beginning to recognize as characteristic of human military planning. Well, sir, we're going to use it to knock on the Kethmoran orbital positions. Very enthusiastically. The transmission ended just as the humans began implementing what their tactical doctrine apparently classified as celestial artillery. The approaching moon wasn't going to impact the planet. Instead, it was going to pass through the orbital zone where the remaining Kethmoran fleet was positioned, and its gravitational field had been modified to create what could only be described as a massive cosmic billiard shot. Captain Vorthe K ordered all non-essential personnel to evacuation stations as gravitational waves began affecting the ship's navigation systems. War correspondent, he said in the tone of someone whose career in military transport was about to include footnotes that no insurance company would believe, I think we're witnessing the birth of an entirely new category of warfare. Zeth Carey could only nod as he watched the humans use astronomy as a tactical weapon. The moon's modified gravitational field was pulling Kethmoran ships out of their defensive positions and sending them tumbling through space in complex mathematical patterns that suggested the entire maneuver had been precisely calculated to create maximum chaos with minimum actual destruction. It wasn't just military strategy, it was applied physics with a sense of humor. The siege of Corvash Prime was entering its second week, and the humans had already redefined what it meant to fight a defensive war. They weren't just holding their positions. They were turning the battlefield itself into an active participant in the conflict. And, according to his intercepted communications, they were just getting started. By day 21 of the siege, Zeth Carey had filled 17 data crystals with documentation that would fundamentally change how the galaxy understood both human capabilities and the nature of warfare itself. What had begun as a routine extermination campaign had evolved into something that required entirely new categories of military analysis. The Kethmoran, to their credit, were adapting. After losing two-thirds of their orbital fleet to what human tactical reports called aggressive lunar enthusiasm, they had regrouped and were attempting a different approach. Instead of overwhelming force, they were now trying precision strikes using their most elite units. It was a reasonable strategy that might have worked against any other species. Unfortunately for the Kethmoran, humans had apparently spent the past 3 weeks converting reasonableness into a tactical disadvantage. Press vessel documenta came a transmission from the surface. This is Sergeant Maria Santos, Human Defense Force Engineering Corps. We wanted to give you advance notice that we're about to field test our new defensive protocol. Fair warning, your sensors are probably going to register readings that violate several fundamental constants of physics. Zeth Carey activated his recording equipment with the resigned efficiency of someone who had learned to expect impossible things as routine morning briefings. Sergeant Santos, what exactly constitutes a defensive protocol in human military terminology? Well, sir, Santos replied, her voice carrying the sort of cheerful enthusiasm that Zeth Carey had learned to associate with impending acts of applied impossibility. Our engineering team figured out that if you take standard defensive barriers and convince them to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, you can create what our physics consultant calls really stubborn walls. The surface of Corvash Prime began generating energy signatures that made Zeth Carey's sensors perform the electronic equivalent of having an existential crisis. Across the human defensive positions, barriers were appearing that seemed to occupy the same physical space, while somehow being completely impermeable to different types of attacks, depending on their angle of approach. Captain Vorthicay joined Zeth Carey at the observation station, carrying a cup of what the ship's mess hall optimistically called coffee, but which bore more resemblance to industrial solvent. War correspondent, he said in the weary tone of someone whose worldview had been systematically demolished by beings who treated reality as a collaborative fiction project. Please tell me the humans haven't actually learned to manipulate dimensional physics using equipment they assembled from spare parts. Before Zeth Carey could respond, the Kethmoran elite assault teams began their attack. These were the hegemony's finest warriors, beings who had conquered species that could manipulate matter at the molecular level and had never encountered a defensive system they couldn't eventually overcome through superior firepower and tactical precision. They hit the human defensive lines with everything they had, and absolutely nothing happened. The energy weapons that should have vaporized the human barriers simply passed through them without effect. Kinetic projectiles that could punch through starship armor bounced off like toys. Exotic matter disintegrators experienced what could only be described as technical difficulties when they encountered walls that apparently existed in a state of selective reality. Sergeant Santos, Zeth Carey transmitted, watching the elite Kethmoran units attempt increasingly desperate attacks against barriers that seem to be ignoring them out of spite. How exactly do your defensive barriers work? Oh, that's the beautiful part, sir, Santos replied, her enthusiasm suggesting either breakthrough, scientific discovery, or complete psychological breakdown. They don't work according to any single principle. Our engineering team figured out that if you build defenses using 17 different theoretical frameworks simultaneously and then ask them politely to cooperate, you can create barriers that are immune to attacks based on any one particular understanding of physics. Zeth Carey's translator gave up trying to process that explanation and simply marked it as uniquely human engineering philosophy. On his tactical display, he watched as Kethmoran weapons that operated on principles ranging from energy manipulation to quantum disruption all failed to affect barriers that had apparently been constructed using what could only be called applied stubbornness. A new figure appeared on the transmission, a human who introduced himself as Dr. Robert Kim, theoretical physics and applied impossibility specialist. He looked like someone who had been living entirely on mathematical equations and determination for the past month, but his eyes held the sort of focused intensity that suggested he was having entirely too much fun. Press vessel, Dr. Kim began, we wanted to demonstrate one of the more interesting applications of our new defensive technology. It turns out that if you extend the selective reality principle to offensive applications, you can create weapons that exist in whatever physical state is most inconvenient for the target. The humans began firing what their tactical reports classified as adaptive projectiles. Each round appeared to change its fundamental properties while in flight, shifting between energy and matter depending on what would be most effective against its specific target. Armor designed to deflect energy beams was hit by kinetic projectiles. Shields configured to stop solid matter were penetrated by exotic energy forms. Personal protection systems that could adapt to multiple threat types simply gave up and failed when confronted with ammunition that refused to commit to any particular state of existence. Dr. Kim, Zeth Carey transmitted, are you telling me that humans have created weapons that actively violate the law of conservation of matter and energy? Oh no, sir. Dr. Kim replied with a sort of smile that suggested he was about to explain something perfectly reasonable that would sound completely insane. We're not violating any conservation laws. We're just interpreting them very creatively. Our projectiles maintain consistent mass and energy. They just distribute those properties across multiple dimensional states, depending on tactical requirements. Captain Vorthik set down his coffee with the careful precision of someone who had given up trying to understand reality and was simply going to observe it until it made sense or until his pension kicked in, whichever came first. War correspondent, he said slowly, in your professional opinion, have humans discovered entirely new forms of physics? Or have they simply convinced existing physics to work differently through sheer force of personality? Before Zeth Carey could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the ship as massive energy signatures appeared across the Corvash Prime system. The humans were implementing what their communications referred to as strategic reconfiguration protocols, which appear to involve convincing reality itself to reorganize according to human tactical preferences. A transmission arrived from Colonel Harrison, who looked like he had been existing on pure caffeine and mathematical inspiration for weeks, but whose expression suggested someone who was about to achieve something unprecedented in the history of warfare. Press vessel, we're entering the final phase of our defensive strategy. We wanted to give you advance notice because we're about to demonstrate what human military doctrine calls aggressive problem solving at the universal level. Zeth Carey's recording equipment automatically flagged the phrase aggressive problem solving at the universal level as requiring immediate analysis by xenopsychology specialists and possibly theologians. Colonel Harrison, he transmitted, what exactly does that mean in practical terms? Harrison's grin suggested the sort of controlled insanity that Zeth Carey had learned to associate with humans who were about to do something that would require new categories in physics textbooks. Well, sir, our strategy team figured out that the Kethmoran have been approaching this conflict using traditional military doctrine, overwhelming force applied through conventional weapons systems. He gestured to something off-screen that was generating energy readings unlike anything in known science. The problem with that approach is that it assumes we're fighting the same kind of war they are. So we decided to change the rules. The transmission paused as the humans began activating systems that made local space-time behave in ways that suggested reality had decided to become more flexible. Energy signatures were appearing across the system that indicated massive manipulations of fundamental forces. Colonel Harrison, Zeth Carey transmitted, though he was beginning to suspect that asking humans to explain their strategies was like asking a hurricane to justify its meteorological choices. What exactly do you mean by changing the rules? Harrison's expression shifted to one of pure, undiluted satisfaction. Well, sir, we're going to demonstrate that when humans say they're fighting a defensive war, we don't just mean we're defending our positions. We mean we're defending our right to redefine what warfare means. The transmission ended just as the humans began implementing what could only be described as tactical reality modification. Across the Corvash Prime system, fundamental constants began shifting in localized areas. The speed of light became more of a polite suggestion. Gravity started operating according to principles that seemed to prioritize human tactical advantages. Energy conservation laws remained in effect, but began interpreting their responsibilities in ways that favored projectiles fired by human weapon systems. Captain Vorthake ordered the ship to retreat to a safe distance that was approximately twice as far as he had previously considered the edge of the galaxy. War correspondent, he said in the tone of someone whose career in military transport was about to include footnotes that would revolutionize multiple branches of science. I think we're witnessing the birth of warfare as applied philosophy rather than applied violence. Zethkari could only nod as he watched 30,000 humans reshape local reality to serve their tactical objectives. They weren't just fighting the Kethmoran, they were fighting the universe's tendency to limit their options, and they were winning. The siege of Corvash Prime had evolved beyond military conflict into something that required entirely new definitions of what it meant to wage war. The humans weren't just holding their positions. They were teaching reality itself that resistance was futile when faced with sufficient human stubbornness and access to engineering manuals. Day 47 of the siege dawned with what human military reports would later classify as aggressive diplomatic communications from the Kethmoran High Command. The message was brief, consisting of a single word that Zethkari's translator had never encountered before: how? The question came from a species that had conquered 47 worlds using strategies refined over millennia of successful warfare. It came from beings whose military doctrine was studied at command schools across 17 galaxies. It came from an empire that had never experienced strategic defeat on this scale. And it was being asked of 30,000 humans who had somehow held defensive positions against impossible odds, while simultaneously rewriting the fundamental principles of warfare, physics, and, apparently, reality itself. Colonel Harrison's response was typically human in its directness, with style. Zethkari watched from the bridge of the Documenta as the final phase of the siege unfolded. The humans had spent 46 days demonstrating that conventional military wisdom was merely a starting point for their tactical creativity. Now they were about to show the galaxy what happened when human ingenuity was given enough time to reach what their technical manuals apparently classified as full operational enthusiasm. Press Vessel Documenta came a transmission from Dr. Elena Vasquez, who looked like she had achieved a perfect synthesis of exhaustion and mathematical triumph. We're implementing our final protocol. You might want to record this for historical purposes, because we're about to demonstrate something that's never been attempted in the recorded history of galactic civilization. Zethkari activated every recording system on the ship, though his 3 centuries of war correspondence had not prepared him to document whatever the humans were about to accomplish. Dr. Vasquez, he transmitted, what exactly constitutes a final protocol in human military terminology? Well, sir, she replied, her expression suggesting someone who had spent weeks solving mathematical problems that weren't supposed to have solutions. Our physics team figured out that if you take all the modifications we've made to local reality over the past month and coordinate them into a single, coherent system, you can create what we're calling strategic universal adjustment. The phrase strategic universal adjustment caused Zethkari's translator to experience what could only be described as an existential crisis before marking the term as requiring new categories of linguistic analysis. Across the Corvash Prime system, energy signatures were building that indicated the humans were about to implement modifications to reality that would affect everything within a radius of several astronomical units. Captain Vorthake joined Zethkari at the observation station, carrying documentation that suggested the ship's insurance policy would require extensive revision after this assignment. War correspondent, he said in the weary tone of someone whose understanding of the universe had been systematically replaced with footnotes that violated multiple branches of science. In your professional opinion, are we about to witness the end of this siege, or the beginning of an entirely new form of existence? Before Zethkari could respond, the humans began activating systems that made local space behave according to principles that seemed to prioritize human convenience over fundamental constants. The Kethmoran fleet, which had spent 47 days learning that traditional military doctrine was inadequate when facing human creativity, suddenly found themselves experiencing what could only be described as tactical physics. Every Keth-Moran weapon system simultaneously developed mechanical problems that defied engineering analysis. Energy weapons began firing in random directions, as if space itself had become confused about which way was forward. Kinetic projectiles started experiencing navigational difficulties that suggested they had forgotten how to travel in straight lines. Exotic matter disintegrators began disintegrating themselves in patterns that resembled what human cultural databases called abstract art. Dr. Vasquez, Zeth Carey, transmitted, watching as the most advanced military technology in the galaxy began experiencing simultaneous technological failures that followed no known pattern of system degradation. What exactly is happening to the Keth-Moran weapon systems? Oh, that's the beautiful part, sir, Dr. Vasquez replied, her enthusiasm suggesting either breakthrough, scientific discovery, or complete transcendence of conventional sanity. We convinced local reality to temporarily redefine what constitutes hostile intent in ways that are extremely inconvenient for anyone trying to shoot at us. She gestured to something off-screen that was generating readings unlike anything in Zeth Carey's 3 centuries of technological experience. Our strategy team figured out that if you modify the fundamental constants in localized areas and then ask physics very politely to cooperate with human tactical objectives, you can create zones where aggressive actions become self-defeating through applied, universal inconvenience. The Keth-Moran forces were experiencing what could only be described as reality-based technical difficulties. Their communications systems began transmitting only human military songs. Their navigation computers started providing directions to the nearest coffee shops. Their life support systems began optimizing atmospheric conditions for human comfort rather than Keth-Moran biology. A new transmission arrived from Sergeant Santos, who had apparently achieved some form of enlightenment through extended exposure to impossible engineering challenges. Press Vessel, we wanted to demonstrate the final application of our defensive philosophy. It turns out that if you extend strategic universal adjustment to include temporal mechanics, you can create what our physics team calls really insistent suggestions about how things should work. The humans began implementing modifications that affected not just current reality, but also retroactively adjusted past events to better support human tactical advantages. Keth-Moran equipment that had been functioning perfectly began remembering manufacturing defects that had never actually occurred. Supply lines that had been secure for months suddenly developed logistical problems that dated back to decisions that no one could actually recall making. Sergeant Santos, Zeth Carey transmitted, though he was beginning to understand that documenting human military capabilities required new categories of both journalism and philosophy. Are you indicating that humans have developed technology capable of editing historical events? Oh no, sir, Santos replied with the sort of smile that suggested she was about to explain something perfectly reasonable that would sound like cosmic horror to anyone else. We're not editing history. We're just convincing the universe that certain events were always supposed to turn out differently, and reality is adjusting itself to maintain consistency. The siege of Corvash Prime ended not with the dramatic final battle that military historians would have expected, but with the Keth-Moran forces gradually realizing that their continued presence in the system was becoming increasingly inconvenient for everyone involved, including themselves. Their weapons had developed philosophical objections to functioning. Their ships had begun expressing preference for traveling in directions other than toward human positions. Their command structure had started experiencing organizational difficulties that suggested the chain of command had become confused about which species it was supposed to be supporting. The formal surrender came via a transmission from the Keth-Moran High Command that consisted of a single sentence. We respectfully request permission to leave before reality becomes even more collaborative with human objectives. Colonel Harrison's response was gracious, permission granted. Please take your equipment with you and have a safe trip home. As the Keth-Moran fleet departed the system with what could only be described as grateful haste, Zeth Carey found himself staring at 47 days of documentation that would fundamentally change how the galaxy understood both human capabilities and the nature of reality itself. The siege had begun as a routine military conflict and had evolved into something that required new categories of analysis in fields ranging from physics to philosophy to theology. A final transmission arrived from Dr. Kim, who looked like someone who had spent weeks solving problems that weren't supposed to exist and had enjoyed every minute of it. Press Vessel, we wanted to thank you for documenting our defensive operations. We hope your footage helps the galaxy understand that humans don't just fight wars, we optimize them. Dr. Kim, Zeth Carey transmitted, in your professional opinion, what exactly did we just witness? The human physicist smiled with the sort of satisfaction that suggested someone who had successfully explained quantum mechanics to a particularly stubborn universe. Well, sir, I think we demonstrated that when humans say never again, we don't just mean we'll resist future attacks. We mean we'll make sure that the universe itself becomes less hospitable to species that attempt them. The transmission ended, leaving Zeth Carey alone with documentation of 47 days that had redefined what it meant to wage defensive warfare. The humans hadn't just held their positions against impossible odds. They had taught reality itself to be more cooperative with human tactical objectives. Captain Vorthicay joined him at the observation station, carrying what appeared to be a resignation letter that would require extensive explanation to his superiors. War correspondent, he said in the tone of someone whose career in military transport had exceeded all reasonable boundaries of possibility. In your professional opinion, what exactly do we tell our respective organizations about what we've witnessed? Zeth Carey looked at his 47 data crystals of documentation, each containing evidence of human capabilities that violated every established understanding of warfare, physics, and the nature of reality itself. He thought about his 3 centuries of war correspondence, which had prepared him to document conventional conflicts between civilized species using established military doctrine and known technology. None of that experience had prepared him to document a species that treated impossibility as a personal challenge and used engineering manuals as comedy material. Captain, he said finally, I think we tell them the truth, that we've discovered a species that doesn't just fight for survival. They fight for the right to redefine what survival means. And they've convinced the universe to help them do it. As the Documenta prepared to leave the Corvash Prime system, Zeth Carey began composing his final report. The siege was over, but its implications would reshape galactic civilization for generations to come. 30,000 humans had held defensive positions against impossible odds, and, in the process, they had demonstrated that human military doctrine contained only one fundamental principle. If reality doesn't support your tactical objectives, modify reality. The galaxy would never be the same. And, somewhere in the depths of space, ancient beings who had existed since the first stars ignited were adding humanity to a very special list. Species whose names should never be spoken in conjunction with phrases like impossible odds or hopeless situation. Because when humans encountered those conditions, they didn't surrender. They got creative. And the universe had learned to be very afraid of human creativity.